After realizing he had just arrested and assaulted the mayor, Michael Trent stood under the soft glow of a street lamp, waiting outside the boutique. A racist police officer confronts a black man outside a luxury store, leading to the officer punching the black man and arresting him afterwards. Joshua's assistant was running late once more, so he leaned against the window, checking the street for any indication of Joshua's car. The darkened windows reflecting the empty street caught his eye, growing impatient as the minutes passed. His assistant's voice barked. Michael turned sharply to see a white police officer approaching him with his hand firmly on his belt. The officer's eyes were sharp, and he sized Michael from head to toe. Michael recognized the posture he dealt with before. "What are you doing here?" More accusatory than, "I'm just waiting for someone," he said evenly. Curious, Michael straightened instinctively and slipped his phone back into his pocket. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the empty street, waiting at this time of night outside a clothes shop. "My ride is running late. You sure you're not loitering? Maybe up to something else?" Michael felt a flutter of annoyance rise in his chest, but he kept his face calm. "I'm not loitering. I'm just standing here waiting for a ride. Nothing more." The officer's lips curled into a... Michael met his gaze, irritation sparking, but he kept his voice steady. "I am just waiting, officer. There is nothing else going on here." His presence seems more imposing. Half smile, though it carried no warmth, standing around in a suit. Michael's pulse. Quicken had been in situations like this before, where explanations didn't matter and assumptions spoke louder than reason. Thus, there's no need for accusations. You don't exactly blend in here standing by yourself this late at night. "Anything I told you. I'm waiting for a ride." The officer didn't move, his eyes locked. Michael daring him to say something more. "You got any IDE on you?" Michael's jaw tightened. He wasn't about to give in so easily. "I don't need to show you my ID. I'm not doing anything wrong. When I ask for ID, you show it? Or is there something you are hiding?" Michael took a deep breath, the frustration now hard to keep in check. "I have told you what I am doing, and that should be enough. There is no reason for this to go any further." Officer's stance changed. Voice dropped lower. "I'm just waiting, the officer." His body now just inches from Michael's. "I'm not a threat. I'm not breaking any laws. I'm just waiting. Right now you're giving me a lot of reasons to keep asking questions." Michael clenched his fists, trying to keep his cool. "I'm not sure, in fact I'm starting. I have every right to be here." The officer smirked, the tension between them thick in the air. "Wick, see about that. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you until I'm satisfied." Michael could feel the weight of the situation. "Think you do not belong here at all." The road remained empty. Seconds stretched into minutes as the officer continued to hover, watching Joshua's car. The officer sensed the unspoken threats hovering in the air and glanced up the street again, hoping to see Joshua's car. The quiet street felt. Michael knew this was not over. Not yet. The officer's hand rested firmly on his belt. His gaze never left Michael's face. "I will be watching him," muttering, his tone low and threatening. Michael did not respond. His eyes hardened as he held the officer's gate. Michael stood strong, his body rigid, as the cop refused to back off. The chilly night stretched on, and still no sign of Joshua. There was nothing more to say, not yet. Two men trapped in an unsaid clash, neither ready to back off. "I'm just waiting for someone. There's no reason for this." The tension between the two men was evident in the air, as if the night herself had been charged with electricity. "I've explained," Michael said, his voice controlled. The frustration was creeping in. His hand never left the belt wear. Michael clenched his hands but kept them at his sides. "What doesn't sit right, the fact that I'm standing here in a suit, or the fact that you don't think I belong here?" His handcuffs and flashlight rested. "I don't care what you've said." His voice cold and condescending. "I'm the one asking questions, not you." Michael's pulse quickened. He forced himself to remain calm. "You're questioning me for no reason. If I were doing something wrong, you would have figured it out by now." The officer's face twisted into a smile. "I figured plenty out." Michael could not hold back any more loitering. Looking for a chance to break into a place like this, Michael could not hold back anymore. "This is what I am waiting for my assistant. You have always thought you are too smart to get caught. I'm doing my job, keeping people like you from causing disturbance in places like this." Michael stepped forward, his voice cold. "People like me? What exactly do you mean by that?" "You know damn well what I mean." The officer's smile vanished, replaced by a hardened glare. "Harassing you. Rising, you think you're slick. Standing here all calm, like you're innocent. But I've seen this before. A suit doesn't change who you are." Michael's heart pounded in his chest. His anger bubbled over you. "You know nothing about who I am." "I know enough," the officer shot back. "You're just another punk who thinks he can talk his way out of trouble, Michael." Michael asked, his voice steady but sharp. His eyes narrowed. "You're real close to stepping over the line, and what line is that?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep control. "You're the one trying to cause trouble where there isn't any officer's hand movement." Michael's blood boiled, but he held his ground. "Authority doesn't give you the right to harass people for no reason." The officer's grip tightened on the cuffs. "You think you're smart, huh? You think you can mouth off to me? I have the authority here." Michael could feel the situation spiraling out of control, the officer's aggression increasing with each word, but he wasn't going to back down. "Not this time you feel threatened?" Michael asked, incredulous. "I'm standing here unarmed. You do not need a reason right now." The officer's jaw clenched, his hand hovering over the cuffs. "I'll decide how this works. You're the one threatening to arrest me. This is not how this works. I'll decide how this goes. I'll decide it how this works." Michael squared his shoulders, meeting the officer's gaze head on. Michael's heart hammered as he watched the officer's hand approach him. The cuffs gleamed under the street lamp. This was it. It was happening, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Michael's heart surged. He murmured, his voice shrill, the fury and terror blending together. "I haven't done anything." Steel glinting in the faint light, the weight of the moment struck him all at once. He couldn't let this happen naturally. He took a step back. "I'm not resisting, but you're not arresting me for no reason. Your pulse pounding in your ears. Wrong." The officer's eyes flared, his grip tightening on Michael's arm. "You just crossed the line." He snapped his arm away. This time the hand twisted with frustration. Michael tried to pull free, his motions quick, but controlled. "Get off me." The officer's patience snapped. "You want to resist, fine." His voice dried with venom as he shoved Michael hard against the boutique window, the glass rattling from the impact. Michael's officer leaned in close, pressing Michael harder against the window, his breath hot on his neck. I told him to stop resisting. Shoulder slammed into the cold surface, the shock of pain radiating through his body. His muscles tense with the surge of adrenaline. Growled. Michael's breath came in short bursts as he struggled to push the officer away. His mind raced. How had this escalated so quickly? "I'm not resisting, you're the one pushing this too far." The officer's grip tightened, his fingers digging into Michael's arm. "I'm done playing with you without warning." The officer swung his fist the punch. Michael gasped, his hand in instinctively going to his face, the sharp sting of the blow still radiating across his face. His vision blurred for a moment, the world spinning around him. Landed squarely on Michael's jaw. A hard, brutal impact sent him reeling. His head snapped to the side, pain exploding across his face. "You're going to learn your lesson." Michael groaned as his chest pressed hard against the glass. He struggled to steady himself, his mind whirling from the shock. "You just had to push it." Cold and merciless, he grabbed Michael again, this time, slamming him face first into the glass with more force now. "Watch me." The officer snarled as he wrenched Michael's arms behind his back. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the metal biting into his skin. Michael's body slumped, texture of the officer's hand squeezing his arms behind him. "You cannot do this," he panted, struggling to find his voice through the haze of pain. Michael stumbled, barely managing to catch himself before his cheek pressed against the cold glass. His mind, swimming between pain and disbelief, tried to turn his head, but the officer's weight kept him pinned. His breath shallow and labored on the ground. The officer ordered, pulling him back from the window and shoving him toward the pavement. Though his thoughts whirled wildly, the adrenaline still coursed through his veins. How had it come to this? He'd done nothing wrong, and now he was cuffed on the ground, assaulted by the very people meant to protect him. His knees hit the ground. His face throbbed. Michael looked up at him, his vision still swimming, but his voice came out strong, although laced with pain. "You're going to regret this," the officer sneered, towering over him with the cuffs now secured. "Not as much as you will." His chest rising and falling, with his own pent-up rage. "Maybe next time you'll think twice about resisting arrest." Michael felt the tight grip of the handcuffs bite into his wrists as the officer roughly pushed him toward the patrol car. His jaw still throbbed from the confrontation. Beneath the pain and tension, a calmness began to flow. The night air pressed down on them. He ordered, his voice cold and full of authority. "I warned you not to resist, Michael." Instead, he straightened himself. He knew something the officer did not, and that knowledge gave him the upper hand. Moved toward the car, opening the back door with a sharp tug. "Why don't you check my ID?" The officer froze, his hand still on the door. Her brow wrinkled in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Michael's smile grew ever so slightly. "You heard me. Check my ID and my wallet." Officer hesitated, narrowing his eyes as if trying to decide whether this was some sort of trick. "You had plenty of time to give me. Now you want to cooperate?" Michael met his gaze, his voice calm and laced with quiet confidence. "Check it. You're going to want to know who you've just cocked before this gets worse for you." The officer's confidence faltered, but he still wasn't totally buying it. "Fine. Let's see what you have," he murmured, reaching into Mai's pocket and pulled out his wallet with a flick of his wrist. The officer opened it and pulled out the ID card. For a moment, he squinted at it, his expression unreadable, but as he handled the information, Michael said, his voice smooth and unhurried. Color drained from his face. The name, the title, everything clicked into place. His eyes darted from the ID back to Michael, incredulity and panic flashing across his features. "You are right," Michael said. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the cuffs, his previous aggression gone, replaced by panic. "Sir, He looked back at the ID, as if hoping it would change, but the realization hit him hard. He had just attacked and arrested the highest-ranking official in the city. You assumed you let your prejudice blind you, and now you're in a situation you can't talk your way out of. The officer's face, flushed with embarrassment and fear, as he hurriedly unlocked the cuffs, freeing Michael's voice, still calm, but now sharper. More commanding. "You didn't realize." His eyes blazing with restrained fury. "You didn't mean to punch me. You didn't mean to throw me against that window and treat me like a criminal." The officer stumbled over. "I'm sorry, sir." "I didn't mean." Michael's voice rose slightly as he rubbed his sore wrists. You thought." Michael snapped, cutting him off again. "That's the problem. You didn't think you saw me standing here, and since I didn't fit your idea of who should be in this neighborhood, you decided I was a threat." "That's what you decided. I was a threat. That's what you decided." The officer stammered, backing up slightly, his voice firm and unforgent. "Do you have any idea what kind of situation you have put yourself in? You understand the consequences of your actions tonight?" The officer's eyes were wide with fear. "Now, sir, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Michael's voice was cold, cutting through the officer's weak resistance. "This is precisely what occurs when you let your prejudice control your behavior. I made a mistake. Michael's voice was low. His face was pale, and his hands still shook. Controlled, but deadly serious. You think that's going to fix this? You think an apology is enough to make up for what you just did? Michael's whole demeanor collapsing under the weight of his realization. Michael took a step back, letting out a long breath. I want your badge number. Now the officer fumbled too. Michael took out his phone, jotting it down calmly before looking the officer in the eye one last time. You will be hearing from me once more. His tone final, and next time you will not be getting off so easily. He turned and walked away. Paralyzed with fear and regret, his mind was already racing ahead. This incident was not only personal, but also a sign of a much more general problem, one he was in a position to finally address head-on, and after tonight change was going to occur one way or another. His jaw still ached from the officer's punch, and the feigned sting of the handcuffs lingered on his wrists. But more than the physical pain, it was the anger bubbling beneath the surface that drove his steps. He could not let this slide. As he turned the corner away from the scene, he pulled out. Joshua Michael said, his voice clipped and direct. I need you to meet me at City Hall now. Joshua's voice came through confused but concerned. What? His fingers shook slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline still coursed through him. Dialed quickly. Happened, I was just about to explain. When you got there, Michael interrupted. Just get there as soon as you could without waiting for a response. Michael ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. His mind raced as he made his way towards City Hall, the lights of the city casting long shadows on the quiet streets. Though more than that, the image of his own reflection in the glass window pinned, bruised, humiliated, stuck with him. This was not just about him anymore. It was about what this unbridled power, the blatant profiling, the disregard for basic respect, represented. Officer's smug face flashed in his memory. Joshua was already waiting outside, his face drawn with concern. What happened? You sounded off on the phone. Michael sighed and took a moment to steady his thoughts before answering. I was harassed and assaulted by one of our own officers tonight. All too familiar, and as mayor had the power to do something about it. Almost arrested, Joshua's eyes widened in shock. What, are you serious? Michael nodded grimly. Dead serious. He didn't know who I was, just as I was up to no good. Joshua shook his head, disbelief written across his face. Don't even know what else to say. Michael said firmly. I'm done letting this kind of thing slide. Reform has been discussed for too long now. I have the proof this isn't just some abstract problem. It happened to Joshua. His eyes looked serious. What's the plan? First, we're filing a formal complaint. Joshua asked. What about the larger issue? Michael's jaw tightened as he remembered the officer's sneering face. Against the officer I have. We are handling this with the police chief. This has to be handled at the highest level. I'm going to make sure this officer faces the consequences of his actions and beyond. Joshua nodded, his expression serious. We are going to take this public if we have to let the community know that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated anymore. The casual violence with which he had treated him is going to be the catalyst I have been pushing for reform in the department for months. Joshua looked at him for a moment, then asked softly, Are you okay? We are not backing down. Whatever you need, good, Michael said. The department will push back, and the officer will try to spin this any way he can. But physically, Michael touched his jaw, wincing slightly at the lingering pain. Michael felt the weight of the night's events settle into purpose. This was his moment to act, to turn the injustice he had experienced. I'll be fine. It's not the first time I've taken a hit. We have to make sure this never happens to anyone. Joshua nodded his face. Grim, all right. Let's get to work. As they entered City Hall, Michael walked into the police precinct, his jaw still sore. Faced into the fuel for the change the city desperately needed, He was reminded of the systematic problems he had been trying to fight for years, but now it was personal, and he wasn't going to let it go this time. Joshua followed closely behind his face set, with a determined expression toward the front desk, where an officer glanced up from his paperwork, immediately recognizing Michael. "I'm here." From the assault from the previous night, the morning light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the tile floor. Joshua followed. "Yes, sir. I'll let him know you're here." He quickly picked up the phone, relaying the message within minutes. Police Chief Harland appeared from his office at the rear of the station. He was tall, his voice controlled but calm. The officer hesitated. Mr. Trent said, extending a hand which Michael ignored, "Come to my office. We need to discuss what happened without waiting for a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor." His eyes swiftly flicked to Michael's bruised jaw, and his expression grew more serious. Response. Heron turned and led them down a long corridor, his steps heavy with authority. They reached his office, and as the door closed behind them, the room grew tense. Harlan gestured toward the chairs in front of his desk, but Michael remained standing. "I understand. There was an incident last night." Chief Harlan said, his voice neutral, though there was. Michael's voice sharp. "I was harassed and assaulted by one of your officers. I almost got arrested for standing on a sidewalk, and you're calling it an incident before Harlan could respond." The door opened, and Officer Greg Mason walked in her face, pale and tight. Michael seemed defensive. His bravado from the previous night vanished, replaced by nervousness as the weight of his actions sank in. He glanced at Harlan, then back at Michael, unable to maintain eye contact. He looked nervously at Michael but quickly turned away. Officer Mason said, motioning to a chair, "We need to clear this." Michael stepped forward, eyes fixed on Mason. "Tell me exactly what exactly we're thinking last night when you decided to ignore everything I said and escalated a situation that didn't need to be anything more than a conversation." Mason shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I knew who you were." "I thought you thought," Michael interrupted, his voice icy. "You thought you had the right to treat me like a criminal because I didn't fit your idea of who should be standing in that neighborhood at night. You didn't care about the truth." Chief Harlan's expression hardened as he turned to Mason officer. "You're aware that this beach behavior is unacceptable. Why didn't you de-escalate the situation?" Mason's eyes flicked between Harlan and Michael. "I made a mistake." He muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought he was. I didn't know you were. I let your prejudice dictate your actions, and when I called you out on it, you responded with violence." Michael said, his voice sharp, "You need to understand what you did. You violated your oath. You are supposed to protect and serve this community, not terrorize it." Heron nodded, his tone more serious now. Officer Mason. Hard, his face pale. "I'm sorry." Mason opened his mouth to respond, but Harlan's cold gaze silenced him. He looked back at Michael's face, pale and regretful, but it didn't matter, the damage had already been done. Michael turned to Harley, his voice calm but strong. "You have crossed a line. This is about a culture in your department that lets officers like Mason believe they can get away with this. He didn't see me as a person he saw. That is a systemic issue, one that needs to be addressed." Now Harlan's face tightened, but he nodded slowly. "I understand your frustration. Mr. Trent and I are dedicated to handling this matter." Michael crossed his arms, his expression unrelenting, addressing it. "This needs more than just an internal investigation. This needs to be, public people need to know that this department is taking actual steps to reform. I want a full report, made public transparency." Michael took a step closer to Harlan's desk, his voice lowering but filled with purpose. "This is bigger than one incident." Chief Harlan's face hardened slightly, "But we'll make sure the investigation is thorough and appropriate action will be taken." Michael took. "Department, if real reforms don't happen, I'll make sure the public knows what's going on. This city deserves better." Heron held Michael's gaze for a long moment before finally nodding. "Understood." Michael turned to Mason one last time. His voice quieter but no less forceful. You thought you could get away with this because you assumed you had all the power. But now you know you don't. And there will be consequences for your actions. Mason didn't respond. He couldn't even meet Michael's gaze without another word. Michael turned and left the office. Joshua, closely behind the air outside, felt lighter. But Michael knew this wasn't over. The fight for justice and reform had just begun, and Michael knew that the momentum was finally on his side. Now it was time to make sure the system changed for good. He left the precinct with a clear mind and his steps steady as he and Joshua made their way to the car. This time, he wouldn't stop until the changes were made. Morning air filled his lungs as he inhaled deeply, processing the enormity of what had just happened. He had put the wheels of accountability in motion, but this was only the beginning. Reform. Real change was going to take more than one meeting with the police chief. Joshua broke the silence as they reached the car. Do you think they will? This isn't something they can sweep under the rug. This is, Michael said, sliding into the driver's seat. Joshua nodded but still looked worried. What if they make Mason the scapegoat, suspend him, maybe even fire him? But nothing else changes. Michael tightened his grip on the steering wheel. That is not going to. This wasn't just about last night. It was about the broken system that had put Michael in that position. His reform agenda couldn't wait anymore. Michael's thoughts raced. The weight of his obligations pressed down on him, but it also drove him. Michael nodded. Wetco public, but on our terms, the people need to hear the truth, and I'll make sure they get it directly from me by the time they reached City Hall. Michael had already. Anxiety still creasing his brow. The story is going to explode. We need to be in control of the narrative. Michael said, formulated a plan. He moved quickly to his office, his mind locked on what needed to happen next. Get the press ready, Michael said, as he sat at his desk, glancing at the clock. I want to hold a press conference this afternoon. No delays. We will outline what happened and make it clear that there will be transparency in this. Joshua paused, his phone in hand. You're going to name the officer? Not yet. Michael said the investigation still needs to happen, but I'll make it. Joshua nodded, already dialing his phone. You're going to tell them everything? Michael hesitated, thinking through the details. Yes. Clear what he did and how wrong it was. Within hours, the media gathered outside City Hall. Reporters, news cameras, and members of the public filled the space in front of the building, all waiting for Michael to speak. He could feel the tension. The city already buzzed with. Joshua walked into his office, phone in hand. We're all. Joshua nodded. Leighton, do this? As Michael walked out of City Hall and approached the podium, the crowd quieted. Cameras flashed, microphones were held high and set. The press is waiting. Are you sure you want to lay everything out? Michael adjusted his tie in the mirror, his jaw still bruised. Michael started his speech calm, but resolute. I have called this press conference today to address an incident involving one of our city's police officers and myself. The crowd stirred, the tension rising as people leaned in to hear more last night. All eyes were on him. Michael paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. He accused me of lying. I was standing outside a store waiting for a ride when I was approached by an officer on patrol, despite my calm explanation of why I was there. Michael paused. When I gently tried to explain myself, the situation escalated. He punched me, handcuffed me, and was about to toss me in the rear of his patrol car. A murmur rippled through the crowd, the shock of his words sinking in. Being up to no good simply because I didn't fit his idea of who should be in that neighborhood. Michael continued, his voice rising with conviction. I was calm, straightforward, and courteous, but that didn't matter to him. What mattered to him was what he saw when he looked at me, not the words coming out of my mouth, not my explanations. He saw a danger and he acted on that assumption. Michael moved back to the audience, his speech firm but ardent. It wasn't until I urged him to check my ID that he recognized who I was. At that instant, everything changed. The panic set in. He uncuffed me, stammering apologies. Error he made. It's not only about me, it's about the systematic problems in our police department. He leaned forward slightly, clutching the sides of the podium. This is not only about one officer, it's about a society that lets these presumptions be made. Based on their appearance rather than their behavior, this is what we have been working to change. The public was silent, hanging on his every word. I will personally ensure that the investigation is transparent. The people of this city deserve to what happens in their police department, and I won't let this be another narrative that fades into the background. Michael paused again, locking eyes with the cameras. But this is bigger than one incident. This is about making real, lasting changes in our police department. I have been fighting for years, and last night I experienced personally why that fight is. Michael held up his hand, silencing them. There will be more to say as the investigation moves forward, but let me make one clear. This is not the end. This is the beginning of real change. Necessary. No one should be treated the way I was treated last night. Reporters began shouting questions, their voices rising in the crowd. Michael stepped away from the podium. Joshua met him at the bottom of the steps, his expression serious that will not stop until every person in this city, no matter who they are, no matter where they are from, can trust that they will be treated fairly and with respect by the very people sworn to protect them. Was strong, Joshua said silently. You did what needed to be done. Michael nodded. It's time for this city to wake up. We have discussed reform long enough now. Now it's time to implement it. As they returned into City Hall, Michael felt the weight of leadership more strongly than ever. He also felt something else, a renewed sense of purpose. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Now it was up to him to push for the reforms the city desperately needed. Michael sat in his office at City Hall, staring out the great windows overlooking the city. The press conference had shook the cities. Since he left the podium, calling from council members, local organizations, and even from his constituents flooded in, everyone wanting more to express their outrage or support or demand faster action. The city was waking up. Joshua entered the leadership, and the phone had been ringing non-stop. Michael sighed and rubbed his temples. Good. We should keep the pressure on. I want people to understand how serious this is. Joshua nodded, stepping closer to the desk. Press is covering the story non-stop. Michael has been getting a lot of attention, social media. Michael nodded slowly, his mind already racing. We need to start with the research into Officer Mason, but that is just the first step. We also expect something concrete and want to know what reforms you will be pushing for. Michael responded, his voice firm. If they're not willing to reform from within, then we'll push from the outside. This is not going. Measuring Joshua's expression was serious. I agree, but you know the police union will fight this tooth and nail. They're already pushing back against your public comments, saying you're jumping the gun. Away before Joshua could reply, there was a knock on the door, and Michael's assistant stepped in. Mr. Trent, the police chief is here to see you. Michael exchanged a quick glance with Joshua, then nodded. Send him in. Chief Harland entered his usual confident stride. Now more measured, he offered a tight lip nod to both men before seated across from. I have seen the coverage of the press conference. I understand why you felt the need to go public, but we need to talk about how we forward from here. Michael leaned forward, his hands. Harland's gaze met Michael's. Mr. Trent. Harrod began, his tone polite but with an edge of defensiveness. Harrod changed in his seat. I agree that Officer Mason's actions warrant a thorough investigation, and we have already suspended him pending the outcome. Clasped in front of him, what is there to discuss the officer's actions? Harrod shifted. Things take time. We cannot rush to judgment. Michael's expression hardened. Chief, I am asking for responsibility. The public needs to know that this is being handled honestly, and that means no delays or excuses. Harlan frowned slightly. I have served this department for over 30 years and know the public's trust is fragile. Right now. But we also have to make sure we follow the correct procedures Michael took. Chief, this isn't only about procedures. This is about rebuilding trust that has already been damaged. Officer Mason's actions are part of a greater problem, and you know it. I have received complaints come across my desk for years. Claims of racial profiling, needless force, and most of them go unaddressed. Harlan's jaw clenched. I'm aware of the issues, but sweeping changes cannot happen overnight. We cannot sit on our hands while this department loses the faith of the very people it is supposed to defend. Michael said, his voice rising slightly. Harlan met Michael's gaze. His expression was unreadable after a long period. We need thorough reform now. We need it right now. Harlan sat back. His mind quickly organized his thoughts first. Then we need to establish an independent monitoring committee, something outside. Second, I want mandatory de-escalation training for every officer in the force with particular training on racial bias. Third, there must be a public reporting system where residents may see the progress of complaints and investigations. Heron raised an eyebrow. The department to review complaints of misbehavior and make recommendations for discipline. Michael nodded. Let them push, but this is non-negotiable. People need to see that there is accountability, that the department isn't protecting its own at the expense of the community. We cannot let internal investigations continue to be handled quietly behind closed doors. An independent oversight committee, you know the union will push back hard on that. Michael responded firmly. This isn't just about making changes to fix what happened to me. It's about ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. Harlan looked down for a moment, clearly weighing his options when he finally... Michael leaned forward again. His eyes locked on Harlan. This is not about targeting anyone. Spoke. His voice was lower. I understand your position, and I agree that changes are needed. I'll bring this to the department, but you need to be ready for a fight, not just from the union, but from officers who feel like they're being targeted. Harlan's lips thinned, but he nodded. I'll take your suggestions to the department leadership about making the police force better. If any officer feels threatened by accountability, then maybe they shouldn't be on the force in the first place. Remember, Harlan paused at the door, turning back to Michael. I won't. He said, his tone more sincere than before. We're all in this together, whether we like it or not. Chief Michael said softly, the eyes of the city are on us right now. Don't let this opportunity for change slip away. Michael rubbed his jaw, still tender. From the night before, he will have to walk over to the window and look out over the city. Next, we keep pushing. Joshua nodded, pacing slightly. So what's next? You think he will actually go through with it? Joshua crossed his arms, a hint of a smile on his face. I think you're ready for that fight. Michael smiled grimly. We stay visible, and we keep the pressure on until real reforms are in place. This isn't just about one bad officer. Change a system Joshua crossed. Knew the battle was only starting, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like victory, real lasting change, was finally within reach. The following day, Michael wasted no time moving his agenda forward. The press conference had started a wave of conversations throughout the city, on the streets and offices, and on every news outlet. Michael knew it wouldn't be long before the opposition from the union and department leadership reached full force. He stood in the mayor's office, staring down a stack of paperwork outlining his ideas for reform. Joshua entered the room, his expression tense but focused. The pressure on the police department was intensiating. Michael nodded. I expected that. Who's pushing hardest? Joshua sighed. The public support your reforms, but there's pushback from the usual suspects. Michael got off the phone with a few council members. Union are cautious. They're worried about the Political blowback we don't have time for. Cautious, Michael said firmly. This isn't about politics. This is about real change, right? But they're politicians. They will protect their own interests. First, Michael glanced at his watch. We need to get these proposals before the council today. If we wait any longer, the momentum dies. Joshua pulled out his. Michael's jaw tightened. That's code for we're going to stall Joshua. The police chief just issued a statement supporting the investigation, but said that the police department cannot allow reforms to weaken the ability of officers to do their job. The community's rallying calls have been getting calls. Groups and local officials all morning. People want action. Then we give them action. Michael responded. Set up a meeting with the council and the police union leadership. We'll hash this out. Michael was standing in a packed meeting room, City Hall. The atmosphere was thick with tension. On one side sat several city council members. From cautious to supportive, expressions ranged from them sat representatives from the police union. A stocky man with a stern face sat with his arms crossed, glaring Michael from across the room. The meeting began with formalities, but Michael quickly cut to the chase. We're not here. He said, his voice clear and steady. The people of this city have spoken, and they want accountability. The system as it stands is broken, and we have an obligation to fix it. The union president, Shed, in his seat, Mayor Trent. We have always worked closely with the city. Some of these reforms you are proposing will tie the... Michael leaned forward. This is not about tying anyone's hands. This is about ensuring that officers are held to the standards we demand from those entrusted with public protection. If accountability weakens your force, then that's a problem with the force, not the reforms. Chief Harlan cleared his throat. We support bettering training, particularly with regard to de-escalation strategies. But the Oversight Committee will cause great conflict for officers who feel as though people who lack knowledge of the hazards they deal with constantly second-guess them. Michael shot him a hard look. We're talking about people who... The public needs a system they can believe in. Right now, the council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them, the Green Councilwoman, leaned forward and agreed with the mayor. If the public cannot trust the police to hold their own accountable, we will never have. Michael's voice was cool. What I know is that this city cannot afford another incident like the one that happened to me, or worse. Every day we delay these reforms. Restore confidence in law enforcement. The union president's face reddened. You're not out there on the streets. Our officers are risking their lives every day. Putting lives at risk. The room went silent for a moment. Chief Harlan finally spoke again, more measured this time. What exactly are you proposing? Michael listed the reforms swiftly, not wanting to leave any room for delay. Public reporting of complaints, racial bias, and de-escalation training. Michael said, an increased responsibility for officers who engage in racial profiling or unnecessary force. This is not just about making the department look better. Michael said this is about making it better. The union president stood up clearly. Furious, you're going to destroy morale. Our officers already feel like they're under siege. Michael said, when the officers who really want to serve and protect are able to do so in a department that holds everyone accountable, the tension in the room thickened as the union representatives whispered among themselves following a long period of unjustified harassment. Or worse, the system will improve. Flinch morale is not the issue here. Joshua caught up with him. Well, it wasn't easy, but we got what we needed. Pause. One of the council members spoke up. We should take this to a vote. We had heard enough. An hour later, the council had agreed to move forward with Michael's reform package. It was a victory. But Michael knew it was only the beginning. Michael said, for now. But the union's not going to take this lying down. We need to get ready for their next action. Joshua nodded. Michael looked at his phone, already thinking ahead. We keep pushing harder than ever. The wheels of reform were in motion. But Michael knew. Days had gone by since the city council decided to proceed